Welcome back to another episode of Deck Building with Bahumaut. This time we'll be constructing a deck that revolves a bit more around the aggressive side of things, so higher attack than defense values, because there's a few cards in the deck that can take advantage of decks that are defensively built. This is a decent counter to that. And also, there's a few effects that combine together with attacking and high power creatures to allow you to speed up your own deck, which is an interesting combination. So that's what we're going to focus on today. To start with, we'll be going straight into green to have a look at our first few creatures. From this point on, you'll probably notice that all the creatures have, or at least nearly all the creatures in this deck, have a power of 3 or greater, and that's because of an enchantment trigger that we'll be using as part of the deck, and we'll have a look at that shortly. But for the moment, we'll start adding in the creatures. So here we have Baloth Pup, simple 3/1 creature. As soon as it gets a +1/+1 counter on it, it gains trample. So it can become a 4/2 with trample, which is quite powerful. And also we are going to include an enchantment which allows an attacking creature to become indestructible. So you can continually annoy your opponent with a 4/2 creature with trample if you get the right combination of cards. So it can be quite an annoying starting creature to come into play for 2 mana, so it's quite a nice little addition. Chuck all 3 of those in there. To synergize, I should say, with our Baloth Pup, we need to somehow generate +1/+1 counters on our creatures. And a great way to do this is lead by example, because it's an instant, and it will allow you to put a +1/+1 counter on 2 creatures. Of course, you don't have to use it on 2 creatures, but it's most effective when used on 2 creatures. So if you're desperate and you need that one +1/+1 counter to survive, you can place 1 if you need to, but generally it's better to wait until you have 2 creatures out. But it can be an extremely effective bump up in power, especially when cast during an attack phase or a defense phase, to give that little surprise boost to your creature that your opponent may not expect. So let's put 3 of those in. Now there are plenty of other cards that add support too, but the majority of them are sorceries, and nearly all of them are, actually I think all of them are more expensive than this, so it's a great card to have, and it synergizes well with Baloth Pup. Now another benefit to having a high attack value is how much damage you can deal with spells that base their damage on creature power. And in this case we have Rabid Bite. So because our creature's base powers are so high, 3 or greater, depending on if we have tokens and things on, we can in fact deal quite a lot of damage with these simple spells. And they're very cheap as well, so quite good combination to have. Rabid Bite acts as our cheap disposal spell, so put 3 of those in your deck. And because having counters on our creatures is important, one other way of providing this is Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, the Planeswalker. As you can see, her second ability there for -2 is put +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So that would trigger Baloth's trample ability. It would improve our spells damage, and even if you're not using the +1/+1 counter ability, you can just spam saplings until you want to use it, or try and save up to draw extra cards and gain life. So it's quite plenty of variety in what you can use her for. and she's quite inexpensive at only 3 mana. So definitely a nice little addition to the deck. You'll see here that this is one of the primary focuses of this deck, and why almost all the creatures in it have a power of 3 or greater. Because we want to be able to trigger Elemental Bond as much as possible in order to increase our deck's speed and drawing additional cards. So the idea here is to have this out as quickly as you can, and then play creatures as normal, and every time you do, you'll be drawing an extra card. So your deck inherently will speed up as a result of that, and we can have up to 3 of these in our deck, so you can be drawing as many as 3 cards for every creature you play, making this quite powerful if you can get it out at the right time. While not always easy to get out at 3 mana, generally you'll at least draw one of them during your game. Now, for those who want a more defensive deck, you might think of including Pulse of Murasa, where you can get your creatures back and gain life. And that's fair enough, it works well with it, meshes well, and allows you to keep a higher life total. You can also consider Wild Size if you want to be more aggressive and deal more damage. Once again, you've got the draw a card ability to help speed things up. But for this deck, we'll stick to the basics and focus more on our creature spell balance. One of the main counters to a deck based around creatures like this is kill spells, obviously. So we definitely want to think about including creatures with hexproof to prevent that easy removal. So we're going to put in all 4 of the Primal Hump Beasts, because they can only be removed via sacrifice. So, or exile, sorry. Exile or sacrifice. And since we're going to be playing a lot of creatures overall, it's unlikely that sacrifice will be able to force us to remove Primal Hunt Beast. So our only real threat is exile or remove from hand. So forcing us to discard it, which makes it quite a nice target for all your support and increase abilities and spells throughout the match, and especially if you put some of the enchantments that we're going to be adding in later onto it. Now, since nearly every creature in our deck is going to be the target of multiple tokens and buff effects, one spell that really gels with this deck as a result of that is Nisa's Judgment. So once again, you get a nice little support ability, which is okay, but it's quite expensive for 5 mana. But the big thing is the second ability you can see there. So basically what it does is it deals the damage of every creature that has a +1/+1 counter on your side of the field to a single target on the opponent's side. So no matter how big the creature is, if you combine the power of nearly all of the creatures you have in play to a single target, you can destroy massive creatures with this spell. And now it's quite expensive as an endgame spell, because that's when the most dangerous creatures are going to hit the field. It's quite valuable at that point in the game. So there is also a Planeswalker that has a similar ability, but takes longer to obtain. So for our use, we're going to include Nisa's Judgment. Now, because we have such an aggressive deck, a great inclusion for this that synergizes well is Nahiri's Machinations, because what it does is it gives your attacking creatures with high attack damage the opportunity to inflict that damage without being killed by blocking creatures, which works really well together with our high damage output. While you won't be able to use the secondary ability there, you don't really need it, and the cheap cost of this enchantment and how quickly you can have it out more than makes up for that. So put all 3 of those in. Now another cheap starting creature we can chuck in is Kor Castigator. While its ability isn't really anything special, we only want it as a cheap 3-1, so it can trigger our beneficial enchantments, and just as a cheap creature to put out early on. So put in a couple of those. Of course, if you want to make your deck a bit more defensive, you can put in Topan Freeblades, because they're a very nice target for support and bonus tokens because of their inherent vigilance ability. The only problem with this is that it won't trigger the elemental bond enchantment, and won't allow us to draw an extra card. So while you can include that, we won't be for that reason. Now, as you can probably see, the main counter to this deck at the moment is a lack of flying prevention. While we do have our Rabid Bite ability, which will remove most cheap flyers, it also behooves us to include some way of making our creatures either fly or remove flyers. So in our case, it's going to be Nimbus Wings, which works extremely well by adding defense to our high attack creatures, and is a great target for Primal Hunt Beast, as it's very difficult to remove Primal Hunt Beast due to its hexproof ability. So initially you might want to put 1 or 2 on your cheap starters, but as the game progresses you'll want to start putting them on Primal Hunt Beasts once they come into play. A card that's a little usually overlooked, in our case, can be a great boon. Patron of the Valiant, Patron, whichever way you want to pronounce it, because nearly all of our creatures should have +1/+1 counters on them. What this does is as soon as it comes into play, it gives all creatures with a +1/+1 counter on them another one for free. Plus it's a 4/4 flyer, and it keeps that balance of flying creatures on our side, because our initial ones are probably a little bit underpowered at this point. So it's a nice beneficial effect and can add a big chunk of power suddenly to the whole field of your side of the battle. But due to its expensive cost, only put in a couple of them. Now we'll move on to our mixed color cards, and immediately you'll see that Veteran War Leader will work well with this deck because there's a decent number of creatures in it. We have green and white, and there's quite a few allies in the deck as well that allow us to use the tap ability of Veteran War Leader. So chuck both of him in. And another one we have here is this card acts as our mana dump. So whenever we don't have anything we want to spend mana on late game, so if the cards in our hand we don't want to play, for example, or have anything else to play at this point, you can spend your 6 remaining mana to buff up your other creatures. You can also, since that ability doesn't require tapping, you can use it mid-battle as well to essentially increase their strength during a defense or during an attack, which can be quite a nasty shock. So put another couple of those in there, and we also have Citadel Castellan, which is a nice cheap creature to put into play and a good target for support abilities because of its inherent vigilance effect. And of course, if you manage to get it through your opponent's defenses, it suddenly jumps up to a 4/5 base value. So nice little abilities there for a 3 mana card. Lastly, we'll be putting in 2 Kor Scythemasters. So 3 mana for a 3/1 is generally pretty expensive, but this one gains first strike whenever it attacks, just by by its own ability, as opposed to requiring an enchantment or something to give it that ability. So can be quite valuable in certain situations, especially when confronted with other high attack, low defense decks, because it'll allow you to deal the damage and get through to kill them first before they can deal retaliation damage and kill your creature. And now it's time to move on to lands to finish things up. So, because we can, we'll put in a couple of Fertile Thickets to give us a little bit of mana searching ability. We have a white deck with quite a few creatures, so Blighted Steppe gels well with that. We also want to put in our dual type mana, if I can find it. There we go. And since we have a couple of renown creatures, and also we have high attack value creatures, in stalemate situations or situations where you have spare mana, Rogue's Passage will work extremely well with this deck, so we'll put in a couple of those as well. And for the rest of it, we'll just put in regular lands. Should give us 22, which gives us 60, which is the right number. So there we go. There's our deck. And we'll move on to breakdown and testing. So as you can see there, it's slightly tilted towards green, so forest side of things, but it's generally pretty close. So you can adjust the mana to take that into consideration if you want, but generally I play with even numbers just as just in preparation for what you draw in general. We also have the mana breakdown, as you can see, quite cheap, the majority of the cards in the deck, but you do have some endgame powers, so you shouldn't really have any problem playing anything, unlike other more expensive decks with more expensive cards in them. So your base speed should be quite high, so we'd be looking at least 2.5 stars here for speed, if you were going to look at the ranking. And as you can see there, creatures and spells are even, so you should be drawing a creature and a spell alternately when you're not drawing lands. Hopefully. It doesn't always happen with the deck's shuffle, but at least in essence you should be. Okay, the deck's together. And let's have a look at the star values before we move on to testing. Okay, as we can see there, we've got our 2.5 speed value. Our base strength is quite high. Well, 2. Because your strength value is really determined by the addition of all power and toughness values on the cards in your deck. So 2 for 19 creatures is quite high. Control, now we don't have a lot of removal spells or kill spells or flyers, so that's why our control is a little low, but with our draw capabilities and abilities to deal quite large damage quite quickly, and also to continually power up our creatures, I think that counteracts that decks that use that quite well. And synergy doesn't really show how effectively these cards work together, because there's not cards with multiple of the same abilities. So that synergy isn't actually representative of what the deck, how the deck works together well. So we're moving on to the testing phase. To really test this deck well, we'll really want to get at least one of our elemental bonds out to show the effectiveness of what can happen when you get that combination going. It would also be nice to get Nahiri's Machinations combined with some early cheap creatures, but we'll see how we go. Okay, we're ready to start off again. Now, Forest, Plains, Rogue's Passage, good start. Nimbus Wings, we have a Primal Hunt Beast for mid-game, and we have our Baloth Pup for early attacks, so quite a good opening hand. Of course, we should combine that with Machinations, Nahiri's Machinations, but you can't always have everything perfect. So it'll do to start us off with anyway. So we have our Baloth Pup out, we also have our Scythemaster ready, and then we'll move on to Primal Hunt Beast, which we'll stack Nimbus Wings on top of. So as you can see, everything's pretty much already lined up. Now I could play Auxiliary at this point, but I'd rather have the Scythemaster out as he's better in attack. He's more difficult to deal with attack-wise. I know Auxiliary's ability is more useful late game anyway. Okay, we have Pious Evangelist. And the good thing is, because I have Scythemaster out, I can continue to attack, even though my Baloth Pup won't actually be able to continue. Okay, change of plans. Now I was going to play Primal Hunt Beast, but because I've drawn Elemental Bond, I'm going to put that out to help speed up the deck. And I can also attack with Scythemaster, because the 2/2 will die if it blocks it. Now anything from this point on that I play with power 3 or greater will give me extra cards. Now I could block it with my Baloth Pup, but I'd rather preserve it because if I can give it trample and a few support tokens, it's going to be quite dangerous. And now that we have our Elemental Bond out, I can play Primal Hunt Beast and get an extra card for it. That should also stop any attacks from the 2/2, leaving me free to attack with the 3/1. Okay, we have Sage of Ancient Lore here. Now, at this early point in the game, it often actually is a downside to play it, because you're still setting up your side, so you'll often be spending more cards than you would later in the game. And it also limits your capabilities. Of course, it depends on how you use it as well, but at the moment I wouldn't really have played it so early myself. Now, in combination with that, we can play a Veteran War Leader. So we have a 4/4, gives us another card, which is good. Now, if it does attack, I can double block it with the Scythemaster and Baloth Pup. I'd prefer not to, but worst comes to worst, I can do that. Ah, okay. So, the 4/4 Angel. Now, I have a choice here. I can block it with one of my weaker creatures, or I can tank the damage. So at this point I'm going to take the damage, because in my hand I have Rabid Bite, which I can use to get rid of that 4/4 Flying Angel, which is suddenly my main concern. Because that 4/4 Angel flips and deals 3 damage to each other creature and each opponent. Now while it may get rid of their 3/2 and their 2/2, it will clear out everything on my side of the field, which is a great danger. So I'm going to use Rabid Bite combined with my Veteran War Leader to get rid of it, as all their mana is tapped, so there's nothing they can do in response. I will also play Nimbus Wings on my Primal Hunt Beast, and I'll play my auxiliary, which I can then use to continue to buff up my creatures. So as you can see, we're keeping them at bay, we're taking a little bit of damage that's unavoidable. If they do attack with a 5/5 again, I'll likely jaw block them. I prefer not to, but they don't really leave me many options. Actually, I don't have to jaw block them because they can use Veteran War Leader's first strike ability. Okay, so we have another Primal Hunt Beast, another Baloth Pup on the field, which all contributes to our War Leader, which is good, and allows us to draw more cards as well, which is good. And there's our second Elemental Bond. I'm also going to attack with the Primal Hunt Beast to weaken that Planeswalker, because that Planeswalker has the ability to remove or to exile target enchantment, tapped artifact, or tapped creature. So getting rid of that is a priority. Set in stone. Okay, as expected, they play a kill spell on my Veteran War Leader. But his job is done, which is slowing your opponent down while you build up your forces. Okay, so I'm quite willing to sacrifice one of my Primal Hunt Beasts, but I think it'll just be easier to Baloth Pup or Primal Hunt Beast. I'll block with the Baloth Pups, just as they're less useful overall. I'll also break the clue there to get an extra card. Well played. I give it indestructible. I honestly did forget that. Card, play another Elemental Bond, play Castigator, which would give me another 2 cards. So as you can see here, now that I have 2 Elemental Bonds out, my deck is a fair bit quicker. I will also get rid of that Planeswalker, as I know how much of a threat it can be. Now's also a good opportune time to use Blighted Step, as I have quite a large number of creatures on the field. So if I wanted more security of health, I could play it. I could use its tap ability. Yep, another 3/4. Okay, so now we're starting to get into the late phases of the game. We could play another one, and okay. So as you can see, we've got Nisa's Judgment, which should allow us to get rid of the 4/4 werewolf. Now, you want to focus on your hunt beasts so that they can continue to rack up counters because they're protected by the hexproof ability. So we'll get rid of our main annoyance. We can also attack with our flyer. And at this point, I will use Blighted Step to shore up my health total, make sure everything's going to be okay. And okay, so at the moment we're pretty well set up. And you can see sort of the general overarching effect of the deck in play. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the actual attack phase. Because the thing is, we can decide where to place tokens. And since I have not that one. Okay, so if my selector will actually let me show you, my Jiraga Auxiliary will allow me to determine where I want to place some tokens. Now, 3/4. Okay, I want a token to allow that to win that battle. So I want one of my tokens there. Who else is being blocked? So my 2/2 will defeat the... Sorry, my 4/4 will defeat the 2/2. My 4/4 will defeat the 3/3. And my 3/2 will kill the wolf as well. So there's no real point putting a token on my 3/1. But I can put another one on one of my hunt beasts. And share out the remaining tokens. So that flips and becomes 2/4, which doesn't really matter to us. Because either way, it's still dead at the end of combat. Okay, so you can see there the general idea. Once you get to this phase of the game, it's all a matter of spending mana to focus your token generation. Oh, not token, counter generation. And the good thing with the hunt beast is it makes it very hard for a spell heavy deck to get rid of your creatures. And there you have it. That's quite a good example of how this deck can be used, so hopefully that's given you a few ideas of how you might want to use it. And of course you can make many tweaks, many different adjustments to that deck by making it more defensive, offensive, adding in more spells, more creatures. There's plenty of options you can use to make it suit whatever playstyle you wish. So, but keep in mind that core combination of Elemental Bond and Baloth Pup, or powerful creatures with high power, which is enough to trigger Elemental Bond. So basically, keep in mind that it focuses around that aspect of the deck, of the core, I should say. Okay, with that, I think we're done for today, and I'll see you next time for deck building with Bahumaut.